This is the application that we will make in this tutorial. The dotted black line represents our jar of candy. The circles inside are the candies. The total count is the number of candies we can find in here in numeric form. If we eat a candy, our total candies will go down to 4, 3, 2, so on. If we decide to restock our jar, we can do so just as easily. If I want to change the color of my candy, not only will the color change, but I will get a notification letting me know that I was successful. And now you can see the candy is green, and once again for pink. To start this tutorial, I have a React application. If you're curious how to make your initial React application, check out my first video linked in the description below. First and foremost, I'm just going to gut out some things that we don't need, and I'll fast forward through this. In our app, I will now make a components folder and a candy jar component. And our candy jar is all set up. I will accompany this component with some CSS, which I made in advance. You can see this on my GitHub. All that's left is importing my candy jar. If you're curious about importing components, see my first video. I will type into my command line first to change into the project directory. Second, I will run the command npm start to start my React app. As you can see, our app is successfully running and our component is successfully imported. Now it's finally time to initialize our state variables. In our candy jar component, I am going to import the React hook called useState. We can now use our useState hook in our candy jar component. The useState hook lets you add React state to function components. It should be called at the top level of a function definition and cannot go after conditional statements. The syntax for using a state hook looks like this: const current state setter equals useState initial state. So now, as you can see, these yellow squiggly lines are just because I haven't used these variables in my code, and this one because I just haven't declared the variable. Variable number 1 is the value of the current state in your application. The state setter function is used to update the value of current state and re-render our component with the next state value. Our initial state is an optional value that can be used to set the value of current state for the first render. We are keeping track of 2 states. One is count. And let's set an initial value default to 5. Second is color. Let's set it to pink. And we have initialized our 2 states, count and color. Let's add some code to our JSX component so we can see our count and chosen color rendered on the screen of our app. I'll add class names throughout the JSX so that my CSS can modify the appearance of our jar. We will get rid of this text, give a title to our component, and now make our jar container. This is the container with the dotted line. If we need any JavaScript functionality inside the JSX component, we can enclose it in curly brackets. In this case, we're going to have to create an array from our count state and then create circles representing candy with that array. Array.from is a static method in JavaScript which will create a new array from an iterable object or an array-like structure. In this case, we're using it to create an array using our candy count. We are passing candy count in as an object that specifies the length of our resulting array. And the second argument is a mapping function to be executed for each element in the array. The underscore is a placeholder for the current element in the array. Since we don't need it in this case, we're leaving it empty. And the index represents the current index of our element based off of that array we created. For every single index in our array, we are going to return a circle. We will need to have a key attribute, which is used in React to help identify each element uniquely when rendering lists. Class name, so our CSS can target our div, and in this case, we are going to be using curly brackets and template literals so that all circles get targeted with the circle class, but candy color becomes dynamic based off of our selected state. Total candies is going to equal our count. So then the state of our count will display on our page as a number as well as with our array of candies. Now let's add some buttons so that the user can change the number of candies in the jar. We will use an on-click event handler that I will update in the next section. This one is called Eat Candy, Add Candy. And I will fill these in a moment. Now we want to add a drop-down option for selecting color. The value that will display in our color selector should be the current color that's been selected, which is our current state of color. We'll add an onChange event handler, handle color change. We are going to do 3 options. First option will be pink, green. Third option will equal purple. Pink, green. Now on to making these event handlers. Each of these event handlers is used to demonstrate some important considerations when updating React state. First, I will use setState on a primitive data type for the color change function. Just as a side note, state should be treated as immutable. In other words, we don't mutate state if we want to change it, and instead we make a copy. This has implications if you're trying to use objects or arrays and store them as a state variable. That is outside the scope of this video, but is something I hope to make a video on in the future. Second, to avoid stale state when updating state with values that depend on the current state, you will pass a function into setState to ensure the call always uses the most updated version of the state. Third, setState is asynchronous inside event handlers. Now let's make our handle color change function. We will use our setter, setColor, to change the state to our new color. To update a state that depends on the previous value, we will implement our Eat Candy event handler. Going back to the principle of immutability, you want to avoid taking our state variable of count and incrementing it directly like this. Instead, the setCount function can be called with an arrow function that takes the previous count value as an argument and increments it by 1. This approach ensures proper state management and avoids directly modifying the state variable. We can copy and paste the same logic for adding candy and change the -1 to a +1. Finally, it's important to note that state updates in React are asynchronous when inside event handlers. This means you can't rely on the updated state immediately after calling setState inside of that handler. If you need to perform an action after the state has been updated, you can use the useEffect hook. As you can see, I have already imported useEffect into my document, and I like to keep the useEffects at the top of my component. We will call the useEffect hook, and inside there will be a callback, and we want to run an alert every time the color changes. I will use template literals to make sure that the color is displayed in the alert. As a second argument in our useEffect hook, I will create a dependency array, and anytime color changes, we want the useEffect to fire. I realized before we start the application, we will need to import our CSS document. Now in the command line, I will type npm start, enter, and we will see that our application runs. You will also notice that our alert fires on that first render. That is because useEffect will fire on that first render. If I click OK, you will notice a second notification, and that is because in development mode, React does a double render. This does not happen in production mode, but it is very helpful for debugging. I'll just click OK, and as we can see, here is our full candy jar. We have 5 candies in our jar. I can eat candy, I can add candy, and I can change the color of the candy. First, I'll get a notification saying that my candy color has been updated to green, and my candy is now visually showing green in our component. I can now change the color to purple, and the same thing will happen. So there is the basics of useState. Our next video will cover the basics of useEffect, and I will show you how we can fix the initial render with your useEffect hook, because sometimes you just don't want that.